The air in their chambers was thick with the scent of sea salt and wild jasmine, a fragrance Myra had spent the better part of a week coaxing into the grand rooms. It was the scent of the azure coves, where they were meant to be waking tomorrow, on the morning of their 10th anniversary. Her travel chest stood open, half filled with silks the color of summer skies and linens as fine as spun moonlight. For a decade, she had been consort to the elven king of the Silenwood, a human heart beating in a timeless, ethereal court. This trip was to be a breath of mortal air, a return to a place that remembered the passing of seasons as she did. King Derin entered not with the quiet footfalls of a lover, but with the heavy, preoccupied tread of a monarch. The scent of old parchment and sealing wax clung to him like a shroud, a stark counterpoint to the room's hopeful fragrance. In his hand, he held a sheaf of documents, his knuckles white where he gripped them. Myra's hands stilled over a folded shawl. She knew that grip. It was the fist he made when duty had its claws in him. "Myra," he began, his voice devoid of the warmth she craved, replaced by a strained practicality that set her teeth on edge. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on some middle distance where geopolitical lines were drawn and treaties were debated. "There has been a development. A border skirmish with the stone clans of the north. Trivial, but it requires my presence. A show of strength. We'll have to postpone the trip." He said it so simply, as if cancelling the sun. He expected an argument, a storm. For 10 years, their disagreements had been tempests of human fire against elven stone, loud, passionate, and ultimately, fleeting. He was braced for her shouting, for the tears of frustration that he found both maddening and, in a secret part of his heart, compelling. It was the human way to feel so fiercely, and he had come to rely on it. But Myra said nothing. The silence that fell was vast and unnerving, a vacuum where a hurricane was meant to be. She slowly, deliberately, lowered the shawl into the chest. Her movements were graceful, but they carried a weight that had not been there a moment before. She turned to face him, and her eyes, the warm, brown eyes that had always been his anchor in the swirling currents of court politics, were perfectly calm. It was a terrifying calm, like the surface of a deep, frozen lake. "I see," she whispered. The sound was so small in the cavernous room that it was nearly lost. Derin's brow furrowed. This was not the script. "It is only for a few days," he said, his tone a clumsy attempt at placation. "A week at most. The coves will still be there." He gestured with the papers, as if they were proof of his irrefutable logic. "This is a matter of state, Myra. You understand." "I do," she said, and the quiet agreement was 1,000 times worse than any protest. "I understand perfectly." She walked toward his desk, a great monstrosity of polished heartwood that had seen a dynasty of kings. His documents were spread across its surface, a kingdom mapped in ink. With a profound and solemn grace, she drew her hand up to her left. The consort's ring was a magnificent burden, a band of woven silver and starlight inquartz, so heavy it had left a permanent indentation in her finger. It was the symbol of her station, his public claim, a beautiful, glittering manacle. She worked it over her knuckle, her movements unhurried. The ring came free with a soft sigh of metal against skin. She placed it on his desk. Not with a clatter of anger, but with the softest of clicks, setting it directly atop the royal seal on the foremost document. The jewel at its heart seemed to watch him, a cold, white eye. Then she turned and walked out of the room. She didn't look back. Derin stood frozen, the papers still in his hand. He stared at the ring, then at the empty doorway. He felt a flicker of irritation, a spike of royal indignation. The dramatics. She was punishing him with silence, a new and admittedly effective weapon in her arsenal. He sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. Fine. Let her sulk. He would deal with the stone clans, and when he returned victorious, he would bring her a gift, a jewel from the mountain's heart, perhaps, and she would forgive him. She always did. He scooped up the ring, its weight familiar yet alien in his palm, and slipped it into his pocket. He had a kingdom to run. He turned his back on the half-packed chests and the lingering scent of jasmine and sea, and strode toward the council chambers, the faint, nagging ache of their bond a thing he chose, for now, to ignore. The council meeting dragged on for 6 hours. The border skirmish, which Derin had dismissed as trivial, was in fact a tangled knot of ancient grievances and fresh insults. The Stone clans were proud, and a careless word from one of his patrols had ignited a feud that threatened a centuries-old treaty. Derin listened, he commanded, he negotiated. He was the king, and he was good at it. His mind was a sharp, cool instrument, dissecting problems and forging solutions. Yet, through it all, there was a disquieting hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. It was the muted thrum of his bond with Myra. The bond was a living thing, a filament of light and feeling that had connected them since their vows. It usually resonated with the warm, vibrant echo of her emotions, her joys, her frustrations, her love. Now, it was a dull, distant ache, a single, mournful note played on a faraway harp. He told himself it was her anger, a conscious banking of her affection to punish him. He'd felt it before during their quarrels, but never like this. This felt less like a dammed river and more like a riverbed slowly going dry. He found his attention drifting. He kept picturing the ring sitting on his papers, its cold fire a silent rebuke. He saw her face, that terrible, placid calm that had felt more like an ending than any fight they'd ever had. He grew short with his advisors, his patience worn thin by a worry he refused to name. Lord Valerus, his oldest friend and most trusted counselor, shot him a concerned look. Derin ignored it, forcing his focus back to the maps spread across the table. Finally, a temporary accord was reached. Messengers would be sent, apologies offered, reparations discussed. It was messy, but the crisis was averted. As the counselors filed out, their voices a low murmur in the grand hall, Valerus lingered. "Is all well, my king?" he asked, his ancient eyes full of a wisdom Derin suddenly felt very young before. "All is well," Derin lied, his voice clipped. "A minor domestic disagreement. The consort was displeased about the postponement of our travels." Valerus nodded slowly. 10 years is a significant milestone. For a human, it is a considerable portion of a lifetime. The observation struck Derin with unexpected force. 10 years. For him, it was a breath. For her, what had she given up in that decade? The thought was unwelcome, and he pushed it away. "She will understand," he said, more to convince himself than his friend. "Duty calls." "Indeed," Valerus said, his tone unreadable. "But it is a lonely call, is it not?" Derin left the council chambers without another word, the councillor's question echoing in the sudden emptiness of the hall. The palace was quiet as he walked back to their wing, the moonlight slanting through the high, arched windows to paint silver patterns on the marble floors. He felt the exhaustion of the day settle on him, and a deep, surprising longing for Myra's warmth, for the simple comfort of her presence. He would apologize, properly this time. He would explain the complexities he had earlier dismissed, make her see the necessity of his actions. He would hold her, and the strained bond would heal, and all would be right again. He pushed open the heavy doors to their chambers. "Myra," he called, his voice softer now. The silence that answered him was different. Before, it had been a tense, waiting silence. This was the deep, profound silence of absence. The air was still, the scent of jasmine and sea salt already fading, overwhelmed by the cool, sterile perfume of the palace itself. The travel chests were gone. He walked further into the room, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The main living area was pristine, untouched. He moved into her dressing room. He stopped in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. The great, carved wardrobes stood open like mouths frozen in a silent scream. They were empty. Every gown, every cloak, every simple human dress she favored for her walks in the gardens, gone. The shelves where she kept her folded shawls were bare. The small, velvet-lined drawers that held her modest collection of jewelry, the pieces he hadn't given her, the simple trinkets she'd brought with her from her old life, were empty. Her silver-backed hairbrush was missing from the vanity. The worn, leather-bound book of mortal poetry she read every night was not on her bedside table. It wasn't just the clothes for the trip. It was everything. She had erased herself from this place. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the armor of his arrogance. This was not sulking. This was not a dramatic gesture. This was an evacuation. He stumbled back into the main room, his eyes landing on the desk. He had left the ring in his pocket, but the impression of it seemed to be burned into the documents. He reached for the bond, not with the passive awareness of before, but with a desperate, frantic grasping. The connection was terrifyingly faint. It was a single, wavering thread of silver light stretching out into an immense darkness, pulled taut and thin, humming with a pain that was not anger, but a deep, resonant sorrow. It was the feeling of a soul pulling away, not in a fit of pique, but with the considered, final weight of a choice long pondered. He had not lost her to a single argument. He had been losing her by degrees, in 1,000 moments of benign neglect, and had never even noticed. The kingdom, his duty, his crown, he had used them as a shield, an excuse, a reason. And while he was busy ruling, his own heart had been quietly, methodically packing its bags. Guards! The word was torn from him, a raw shout that shattered the tomb-like silence of the room. 2 of his personal guard appeared in the doorway in an instant, their expressions a mixture of alarm and confusion at the sight of their king, his face pale, his composure utterly shattered. "Find her," Darren commanded, his voice shaking with an emotion he hadn't felt since he was a child, pure, unadulterated fear. "Track her. Now." "My king," the captain began, "the consort." "She is gone," Darren said, the words tasting like ash. He closed his eyes, focusing all his will on that fragile, fraying thread of their bond. It pulled south, away from the ethereal spires of the Silenwood, away from the safety of his domain, toward the chaotic, unpredictable lands of men. "Ready my horse. I am going myself." He would not send others to retrieve his heart. He had left it unattended for too long. He would fetch it himself, or he would die trying. The kingdom could wait. For the first time in his reign, for the first time in his long life, nothing in the world mattered more than the faint, silver thread leading him back to her. Darren rode as if the spirits of the wild hunt were at his heels. He eschewed the royal carriage, the slow and stately procession that befitted a king. He took only his fastest steed, a black charger named Shadow, whose hooves struck sparks from the cobblestones of the royal city. He wore no crown, no regal finery, only simple, dark leathers fit for a hard journey. His guards struggled to keep pace, their heavy armor a disadvantage against his desperate speed. The city of Silverwood fell away behind him, its crystalline towers and glowing bridges fading into the twilight. He rode through the whispering forests of his domain, the ancient trees bowing their heads as if in sorrow. The air grew heavier, losing its clean, magical crispness, taking on the loamy, complicated scent of the mortal world. The bond was his only compass, a persistent, painful tugging in his chest that guided him unerringly south. Each mile he crossed, the thread seemed to grow more tenuous, and the fear in his gut coiled tighter. He rode through the night and into the next day, stopping only to water his horse, his own body numb to fatigue. The world blurred into a smear of green and brown. He was a king, a being of immense power, yet he felt utterly helpless. He could command armies, shape landscapes with a word, but he could not mend the connection he himself had allowed to fray. He could not command her to return. The bond led him to a bustling human town called Barrows Deep, a place of cobbled streets, timber-framed houses, and the pervasive smell of coal smoke and fried onions. It was a chaotic, vibrant, messy place, so utterly different from the serene, ordered beauty of his palace. Here, life was loud and fleeting. People shouted, laughed, argued in the streets. Their faces were etched with worries Darren had never had to consider: the price of bread, the coming winter, the health of a child. This was her world, the one she had left behind for him. He looked an alien here. His pointed ears, the faint luminescence of his skin, the silver of his hair, they marked him as other. People stared, some with awe, some with suspicion. He ignored them, his gaze fixed, his purpose absolute. The silver thread in his soul led him to the town's grimiest corner, to an inn called the Bent Nail. It was a squat, ugly building, with smoke-stained windows and a raucous sound spilling from its open door. The air inside was thick with the stench of stale ale, sweat, and sawdust. A bard in the corner was singing a bawdy tune, his lute slightly out of key. Darren, who was used to the celestial harmonies of the court musicians, felt his senses recoil. But the bond pulled him forward, through the jeering crowd, up a rickety, groaning staircase. It stopped before a plain wooden door at the end of a dark hallway. Room 7. He stood before it, his heart hammering against his ribs. He, who had faced down dragons and negotiated with demigods, was terrified of a simple wooden door. What would he find on the other side? A woman in tears? A woman screaming with rage? Or worse, the woman he had seen in their chambers, a stranger with a placid, empty calm in her eyes? He raised a trembling hand and knocked. The sound was too loud in the narrow hall. Silence. For a terrible moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, the latch clicked and the door swung inward. Myra stood there. She was not crying. She was not angry. She was wearing a simple brown woolen dress, the kind a barmaid might wear. Her hair was tied back with a piece of twine. There were no jewels on her hands, no silks on her skin. She looked tired, her face pale, but her eyes were clear. She looked like the woman he had first met a decade ago, a librarian's daughter with an insatiable curiosity and a laugh that could startle birds from trees. The recognition was a physical blow, a punch to his soul that left him breathless. He had forgotten this version of her, the woman who existed before she became a king's consort. "Derin," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of surprise, as if she had been expecting him. He pushed past his fear, his old instincts as a king taking over. He had to fix this, to command the situation back into order. "Myra, what is this madness?" he began, his voice harsher than he intended. "To leave without a word. To come to this place. Pack your things. We are going home." She didn't flinch. She simply looked at him, her gaze steady. "This is a word, Derin. Perhaps the only one you might have heard." She took a small step back, leaving the door open for him to enter. The room was tiny, containing little more than a lumpy bed, a rickety table, and a cracked washbasin. It was a cell compared to her opulent palace suite. And yet, she seemed to belong here more than she ever had there. He stepped inside, the small space forcing them into a proximity that felt both intimate and agonizing. He wanted to reach for her, to pull her into his arms and feel the world right itself. But a chasm lay between them, wider than the room. "I don't understand," he said, and it was the truest thing he had ever spoken. "The trip. Is this all because I cancelled a trip?" A sad, small smile touched her lips. "No. It was never about the trip." She walked to the room's single grimy window, looking out at the muddy alley below. "The trip was just the last page of a very long book. A book I realized I didn't want to finish reading." He took a step toward her. "Then tell me. Make me understand. Shout at me. Curse me. Throw something. Do something." She turned from the window, and her eyes were filled with a sorrow so deep it threatened to drown him. "I can't. I don't have the energy for it anymore. The fighting, the arguing, it was my attempt to be seen by you, Derin. To make you look up from your papers and your maps and see me standing there. But I'm tired of shouting." She finally met his gaze, and her voice dropped to a whisper that held more power than any scream. "I am lonely," she said, and each word was a carefully placed stone on his heart. "I am lonely even when you are there. In our bed. At our table. In a room full of people. I have never been more alone than when I am standing right beside you." The words struck him dumb. They bypassed his intellect, his royal pride, and pierced him to the core. "Lonely even when you are there." It was an indictment of his entire being, of their entire life together. He saw a slideshow of moments, a decade of her solitude. Myra, sitting alone at the grand dining table while he worked late into the night. Myra, walking the gardens by herself while he held court. Myra, trying to tell him about her day, her voice fading as she saw his gaze was distant, his mind already on the next crisis. He was a constant presence and a constant absence. He had given her a palace, a title, jewels, but he had withheld the one thing she truly needed, himself. He had not lost her. He had given her away, piece by piece, in exchange for his crown. The realization was devastating, a truth so absolute it brought him to his knees. Not literally, his body remained rigid, but his soul, his pride, his very identity as a king and a husband, collapsed into ruin at her feet. He finally understood. He couldn't order her home. He couldn't fix this with a gift or a promise. The foundation was rotten, and the entire structure had to be torn down and rebuilt, stone by painstaking stone. And he had to be the one to lay every single one. Darren stood in the suffocating silence of that tiny room, the echoes of her whispered confession reconfiguring the world around him. His authority, his power, his title, they were dust. Useless. Here, in this squalid inn, facing this quiet, heartbroken woman, he was not a king. He was just a man who had failed the person he loved most. The path forward was terrifyingly unclear, a fog with no landmarks. His old methods were useless, command would be met with silence, and promises would be met with justified disbelief. He needed a new language, one he had long forgotten how to speak. He took a slow breath, the air thick with the smell of cheap soap and damp wood. His first instinct was to argue, to defend himself with a list of his burdens and responsibilities. But he saw the futility of it in her tired eyes. She already knew his excuses. She had lived them for 10 years. Instead, he did the only thing he could. He surrendered. "I see," he said, his voice raspy with emotion he could no longer suppress. He looked around the small, bare room, at the threadbare blanket on the bed, at the single candle stub on the table. He looked at her, truly looked at her, in her simple woolen dress, and saw not a barmaid, but a queen in exile. An exile he had forced upon her. "I am suspending the council," he stated, not to her, but to the universe itself. It was a vow. He turned without another word and left her room, pulling the door gently closed behind him. He walked down the stairs, his movements stiff. The inn's common room was still loud, but the noise seemed distant, muffled. He found the innkeeper, a portly man with a suspicious squint, and placed a pouch of gold on the bar that was heavy enough to make the man's eyes widen. "I need a room. For as long as it takes," Darren said. "And I need a message sent to the Silenwood. Immediately." The message was simple, relayed to his bewildered guards who had been waiting anxiously in the street. The royal council was suspended. All matters of state were to be deferred to Lord Valerus, who would act as regent in his stead. He was not to be disturbed unless the kingdom itself was on fire. His absence was indefinite. The act was unprecedented. No Silenwood king had ever abandoned his post for a personal matter. It would send shockwaves through the court. There would be confusion, panic, perhaps even challenges to his authority. He didn't care. The kingdom had been his priority for his entire reign. Now, Myra was. Let the kingdom shake. His own world had already crumbled. He took the room next to hers. It was identical in its misery, small, cold, and smelling faintly of mildew. He sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress and did nothing for a very long time, simply feeling the proximity of her through the thin wall, a painful, hopeful warmth. He was a king in a 10-foot by 10-foot cell, and for the first time, it felt like the right place to be. The first week was a study in silence and distance. Myra went about a new life she was building for herself. She had taken a job at the inn, not as a barmaid, but helping the innkeeper's wife in the kitchens. Darren would see her in the early mornings, her sleeves rolled up, a smudge of flour on her cheek, her hands kneading dough. She moved with a purpose he hadn't seen in years. She did not acknowledge him. When he entered the common room for his meager breakfast of dry bread and weak ale, she would turn her back, her shoulders rigid. He didn't try to speak to her. Words were cheap. He had to prove his contrition with action, with presence. He spent his days in a quiet, relentless observation. He learned her new rhythms. She rose before the sun. She worked until midday. In the afternoons, she would walk to the town's small, dusty library, and he would follow at a distance, watching as she lost herself among the books, a quiet joy on her face he hadn't realized he missed so desperately. He saw the way the townspeople treated her. They didn't bow. They called her Myra. They smiled at her, shared gossip, asked after her well-being. She was not a consort here. She was a neighbor. She was a person. He began his courtship not with grand gestures, but with the smallest of offerings. One morning, he rose even earlier than she did. He ventured into the nearby woods, the damp earth clinging to his fine leather boots, and found a patch of dawn-petal flowers, tiny, star-shaped blossoms that she had once mentioned reminded her of her childhood home. He left a small, simple bouquet on the floor outside her door, then retreated to his own room before she emerged. He heard her door open, then a long pause. When he dared to peek out later, the flowers were gone. Another day, he noticed the innkeeper's wife complaining about the dullness of her kitchen knives. That night, while the inn slept, Derrin sat by the dying embers of the common room fire and, using a whetstone he purchased from the blacksmith, sharpened every single knife until it had a razor's edge. He did it silently, meticulously. The next morning, he watched from his shadowed corner as the woman exclaimed in surprise and gratitude. Myra was there, and he saw a flicker of something in her eyes as she glanced toward him, not warmth, not yet, but a sliver of grudging acknowledgement. He was a king, accustomed to servants and luxury, but he forced himself into this new, humble existence. He learned to mend his own clothes, to wash in cold water, to endure the lumpy mattress that made his back ache. He sold one of his gauntlets to the blacksmith for human currency, an act of profound humility that felt like shedding a piece of his old skin. He was stripping himself down, piece by piece, to the man beneath the crown, hoping that man was someone she could one day love again. One afternoon, a late autumn storm blew in, the wind howling and the rain coming down in icy sheets. Myra was returning from the library, caught in the downpour. She was carrying a stack of books, trying to shield them with her thin cloak, shivering. Derrin, who had been watching from his window, didn't hesitate. He grabbed his own heavy, elven-spun cloak, a garment waterproofed with old magic, and strode out into the storm to meet her. He didn't speak. He simply came up beside her and draped the cloak over her shoulders. It enveloped her, shielding both her and the precious books from the rain. She stopped, startled, and looked up at him. Rain dripped from his silver hair into his eyes. He was soaked, but he didn't seem to notice the cold. "Your books will be ruined," he said, his voice quiet against the roar of the wind. She clutched the cloak, its impossible warmth a stark contrast to the biting cold. For the first time in weeks, she spoke to him directly, her voice wary. "And you?" "I have weathered worse storms," he replied, his eyes holding hers. It was a small moment, but it was a beginning. A shared silence in the heart of a storm. She didn't shrug off the cloak. She pulled it tighter and continued toward the inn, and he walked beside her, a silent, drenched guardian. They didn't speak again, but for the first time, they were walking in the same direction. The ice was beginning to crack. The second month of Derrin's self-imposed exile passed in a fragile truce. The grand gestures of a king were replaced by the quiet consistency of a man trying to earn his place. He had established a new routine, one that orbited Myra's without intruding upon it. He took on odd jobs around the inn to pay for his lodging, his royal pride packed away with his fine clothes. He chopped wood for the hearths, his hands, once accustomed only to the weight of a scepter or a sword, becoming calloused and rough. He mended a broken fence, his elven precision making the repair stronger than the original. The innkeeper, initially suspicious, began to treat him with a grudging respect. They called him Derrin, the tall stranger. No one knew he was a king. He was just a man paying his penance. Myra watched him. He felt her gaze on him as he worked, a cautious, questioning wait. They had started to talk again, in clipped, careful sentences. He would ask her about the books she was reading, and she would give him short, polite summaries. He told her about his own work, the simple satisfaction of a perfectly split log or a mended hinge, and sometimes, a ghost of her old smile would touch her lips. He was showing her a side of himself he'd never revealed, the man stripped of his crown, capable of simple, useful things. The turning point came on a cold, clear night at the beginning of the third month. A royal messenger, unable to wait any longer, had finally tracked him down. The man was aghast to find his king with an axe in his hand and sawdust in his silver hair. He delivered a thick satchel of letters from Lord Valerus, detailing escalating tensions with the southern lords and an urgent trade dispute that required the king's immediate intervention. The kingdom was calling him back. Derrin took the satchel to the common room, which was empty save for Myra, who was polishing tankards by the fire. He sat at a table near her, the leather pouch a heavy, intrusive presence between them. He didn't open it. He just looked at it, then at her. "The regent requires my return," he said, his voice low. The kingdom has problems that, it seems, only a king can solve. Myra stopped her polishing, her knuckles white on the pewter mug. Her back was to him, but he could feel the tension radiating from her. This was the test. Everything he had done for the past 2 months hung in the balance of this moment. Would he choose the crown or her? You should go, then, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Your people need you. He reached out and slowly, deliberately, pushed the satchel into the heart of the fire. The leather blackened, curled, and then burst into flames. The official seals of his kingdom melted like wax. Myra gasped and spun around, her eyes wide with disbelief as the urgent missives turned to glowing ash. My people have a regent, Darren said, his gaze locked on hers, unwavering and absolute. I am not going anywhere. Not without you. And even if you agree to come back, things will be different. I will be different. This, he gestured to the fire consuming his royal duties, is my promise. Tears welled in her eyes, the first he had seen since that day in their chambers. They were not tears of anger or frustration, but of a deep, sorrowful catharsis. Promises are easy to make in a tavern, Darren. A palace has a way of changing them. Then we will change the palace, he insisted, rising from his chair and moving to stand before her. He didn't touch her, keeping a respectful distance, but his proximity was a force of its own. This time, I need you to tell me. Tell me everything. All the years of silence. All the lonely moments. I will not offer excuses. I will not defend myself. I will simply listen. And so she did. The words that had been locked away for a decade finally came pouring out. She spoke of the suffocating opulence of the court, the way the ancient, immortal elves looked through her, a fleeting human spectacle. She spoke of feeling like an ornament, valued for her beauty and her novelty but not for her mind or her heart. She described the hollow ache of celebrating her human holidays alone, of trying to explain the simple joy of a snowfall to a husband whose mind was on crop yields and troop movements. The bond, she whispered, her voice breaking, it was supposed to be our connection. But it became a constant reminder of your absence. I could feel you, your stress, your worries for the kingdom, your focus on everything but me. It was like being tied to a star, so bright and so powerful, but a million miles away. I was freezing in its light. He listened to every word, and each one was a blade twisting in his gut. He didn't interrupt. He didn't flinch. He absorbed her pain, letting it scour him clean of his pride and his ignorance. When she finally fell silent, her face streaked with tears, her body trembling with the force of her confession, he finally reached out, his calloused hands gently taking hers. I am sorry, he said, and the two simple words were imbued with the weight of his entire soul. I am sorry for every lonely dinner, for every unanswered question, for every moment I was there but not present. I saw you as the most beautiful part of my life, but I treated you as a part, not as the center. I saw my duty to the kingdom as my purpose, and I failed to see that my greatest duty was to you. I was a fool, Myra. A blind, arrogant fool. He knelt before her then, the king of the Silenwood on his knees on the dirty floor of a common inn. I cannot erase the past. I cannot give you back those 10 years. But I can offer you the future. A different future. One where my queen is not a consort, but a partner. Where her voice is heard in council, not just in our chambers. Where her happiness is not a secondary concern, but the very foundation of the king's strength. Come home with me, Myra. Not to the life we had, but to a new one we will build together. One where you will never be lonely again. Her tears flowed freely now, but a watery smile trembled on her lips. She squeezed his hands, her grip surprisingly strong. Get up, you idiot king, she whispered. You'll ruin your trousers. It was not a yes, not yet. But it was hope. It was the sound of a door, long closed and barred, slowly creaking open. The fire had died down, leaving only the glowing embers of his discarded duty, and in their warm light, he began the patient, careful work of rebuilding his world. The journey back to the Silenwood was a slow, deliberate pilgrimage. They didn't take the direct route but meandered through the mortal lands, Darren seeing them for the first time not as territories to be managed, but as Myra's home. He listened as she named the wildflowers by the roadside and told him the local folklore attached to a peculiar standing stone. They stayed in small inns, sharing meals in noisy taprooms, and for the first time, Darren felt like a part of the vibrant, messy tapestry of human life rather than an observer watching from a gilded cage. He was not a king retracing his steps to reclaim his consort, he was a man walking beside the woman he loved, rediscovering the world through her eyes. Their arrival at the palace was met with a mixture of relief and chaos. Lord Valerus greeted them at the gates, his ancient face etched with worry that melted into a profound understanding when he saw the way Darren held Myra's hand, not as a possession, but as an anchor. The court was in an uproar. Councillors, generals, and dignitaries clamored for his attention, thrusting documents at him, demanding decisions. The old Darren would have immediately been consumed, drawn back into the relentless machinery of governance. But this Darren was a different man. He held up a hand, silencing the clamor. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried an authority that brooked no argument. "The council will reconvene in 3 days," he announced, his gaze sweeping over the astonished faces. "My first decree will be the reformation of this body. From this day forward, the consort will hold a permanent, voting seat at the council table. Her counsel will be sought, and her word will carry the weight of the crown. We will rule together, or I will not rule at all." He turned to Myra, his eyes for her alone. "Our second order of business will be the establishment of our new residence in the summer pavilions by the lake. The royal wing of this palace is a seat of government. Our home will be a place of peace." He did not ask her if this was acceptable. They had planned it together on the long road home. He was simply informing his court of the new reality. A murmur went through the assembled lords and ladies. It was a revolution, enacted with a few calm sentences. He was elevating immortal to a position of unprecedented power. He was decentralizing the monarchy from its ancient seat. He was placing his personal life, his marriage, at the very heart of his public rule. It was scandalous. It was magnificent. He led Myra away from the stunned court, leaving Valerus to manage the fallout. In the familiar opulence of their old chambers, which now felt cold and impersonal, he retrieved a small, velvet box from a locked drawer. "I had this sent for while we were away," he said, his voice soft. He opened the box. Inside lay the consort's ring. But it was changed. The heavy, ornate band had been replaced by 2 slender, interwoven strands of silver and gold, one representing his elven longevity, the other her mortal fire. The great, cold diamond at its center was gone, replaced by a simple, luminous moonstone, her favorite gem. It was no longer a badge of office. It was a poem. "It is no longer the consort's ring," he said, taking her hand. "It is yours. If you will have it. It is not a symbol of your station, but a symbol of my promise. A promise that you will always be seen. That you will always be heard." Myra looked from the ring to his face, her eyes shining. She saw no trace of the preoccupied, distant monarch she had left 3 months ago. She saw only Darren, her Darren, his heart finally, completely, in his eyes. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. He slid the ring onto her finger. It felt light, a perfect fit. As it settled into place, the bond between them, which had been a tender, healing thread, flared into a brilliant, dazzling nova of light and warmth. It was stronger than it had ever been, a fusion not just of love, but of understanding, forgiveness, and a shared, hard-won future. It filled the cold room with a palpable joy. 3 days later, after the council had been officially reformed and the court was still reeling from the shift in power, Darren and Myra finally left for their anniversary trip. They traveled not with a royal retinue, but by themselves, 2 people on a quiet holiday. They journeyed to the Azure Coves, a secluded stretch of coastline in the mortal world where the cliffs were white and the sea was a startling, impossible blue. The small cottage he had rented for them was simple, rustic, and perfect. It smelled of salt and wood smoke. There were no servants, no advisors, no petitioners. There was only the sound of the waves crashing on the shore and the cry of gulls overhead. On their first morning there, the day that should have been their anniversary 3 months prior, they woke with the sun. Darren watched as Myra walked out onto the small balcony overlooking the water. She was wearing a simple linen dress and her hair was unbound, whipping in the sea breeze. She closed her eyes, a look of pure, unadulterated peace on her face. He came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, breathing in the scent of her hair, mingled with the salt of the sea. "Is this what you imagined?" he murmured into her ear. She leaned back into him, her hand covering his over her stomach. "No," she said softly. He felt a flicker of his old anxiety. "No." She turned her head, her lips brushing his cheek. "It's better. I imagined a vacation. A temporary escape from our life." She turned fully in his arms, her warm brown eyes full of a love so profound it made his heart ache with gratitude. "This isn't an escape, Darren. This is just our life. Now." He understood. The trip was no longer a desperate flight from their reality, it was a celebration of their new one. His duty was not a distant, demanding master he served in a cold stone fortress. It was here, in his arms. The heart of his kingdom was not a throne, but the steady, human beat of the heart pressed against his own. He had almost lost everything by prioritizing his crown over his love. He had won it all back by learning, finally, that his love was his crown. He lowered his head and kissed her, and the kiss was not one of passion or of desperation, but of a deep, quiet, and everlasting homecoming.